Hey everybody, this is Andre here covering for Kevin on the Kevin Breeze channel, and in this video, we're going to be doing a comparison between the Motorola Moto G Stylus 2021 and the Motorola Moto G Power 2021. Now these phones are both successors of their 2020 versions. To get more information on their pricing and availability, be sure to check the links in the description because that's going to have all of that. That being said, let's get started. So the Moto G Power has a 6.8-inch IPS LCD display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 386, an aspect ratio of 20:9, and a screen-to-body ratio of 84.8%. It has a 16 megapixel front-facing camera, and this camera, as you can see here, is a hole punch design. The Moto G Power has a 6.6-inch IPS LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 266, an aspect ratio of 20:9, and a screen-to-body ratio of 83.8%. The front-facing camera here is also a hole punch, and this camera is 8 megapixels. Now, as you can clearly see from this side-by-side comparison, the screen of the Moto G Stylus is a lot bigger than that of the Moto G Power. Not only that, but the quality of the display itself is definitely quite a bit better. Not only does the Moto G Stylus have a higher resolution and a significantly higher PPI than that of the Moto G Power, but it also does have a higher screen-to-body ratio as well, meaning the bezels are going to be a bit thinner, giving it a more modern look and making more room for this screen. So overall, the Moto G Stylus is definitely going to have a better display, and if you're doing something like content consumption, that's definitely going to come in handy, and that's something you're going to want to keep in mind. In addition to that, the front-facing camera of the Moto G Stylus does seem to be a little bit better, but we'll see more of that later on. Now, the Moto G Stylus has 128 gigabytes of internal storage with micro SD card expansion, and the Moto G Power has 32 gigabytes of internal storage with micro SD card expansion. Now, there is a variant of this phone that does have 64 gigabytes of internal storage, but for the purposes of this video, this version of the Moto G Power 2021 is the 32 gigabyte variant. Now this is definitely a big difference in storage. Even if you choose the 64 gigabyte variant of the Moto G Power, the Moto G Stylus is still going to have double the internal storage, and I always say it's better to have more storage than you need than less. So even if you don't think you're going to be using all of it, I always do think it's a good idea to have as much internal storage as possible, even if you can expand the storage with a micro SD card. It's just better, in my opinion, to have more internal storage on the phone itself. And in the case of this particular device with the 32 gigabytes, the Moto G Stylus does have quadruple the internal storage of the Moto G Power, and that is definitely a big difference. To give you an idea of what this looks like, they have almost the exact amount of stuff on them. They both have 14 gigabytes in the system and a very similar amount of storage being used up for apps. And as you can see, the percentage taken up is a huge difference. 19.66 gigabytes is taking up only 15% of the internal storage for the Moto G Stylus, whereas 19.13%, which is technically even a little less, is taking up 60% of the internal storage on the Moto G Power. This is definitely a big difference. If you have larger apps, or if you take a lot of photos and videos, whatever the case may be, you're definitely going to want as much storage as you can get, and I don't think 32 gigabytes is nearly enough. I would say 64 gigabytes is a good minimum, but 128 is really preferred. Now, neither of these phones have wireless charging, which I think is a little bit disappointing. Wireless charging is definitely a nice last resort if your charging port gets damaged or something like that happens. It's nice to have an alternative way to charge your phone, and it gives it a little bit more longevity. But unfortunately, these phones don't have wireless charging. That's a feature that's usually more reserved for higher end and more flagship phones. And it's a feature that I personally would like to see implemented in more entry-level and mid-range phones in the future. That being said, both of these phones do have a fingerprint scanner and face unlock. It's really nice that these phones have both those features. I like to have a few different options to unlock the phone because sometimes, depending on what you're doing at this particular moment, one may be more useful than the other. So it's nice to have both options just in case. One thing I really like about both of these phones is the location of the fingerprint scanner. right on the power button. That's really hard to beat. There's really not going to be any faster way to open your phone. Maybe if you're using face unlock and it happens to be pointing right at your face at the perfect time, but really, whether it's out of habit or on purpose, most people do end up touching the power button in some way when they're trying to unlock their phone anyway. So having the fingerprint scanner right there so it'll automatically unlock when you do that is just great. That being said, let's give them a try and see how they perform. Starting with the Moto G Stylus. One more time. Well, that was really fast and responsive. Let's try the fingerprint scanner for the Moto G Power. One more time. Well, as you can see, not only is the location of these fingerprint scanners great, but they're really fast and responsive. There's really not a whole lot to say about them. Definitely no complaints here. Now taking a look at the camera setup of these phones, the Moto G Stylus has a 48 megapixel rear camera, an 8 megapixel ultra-wide camera, a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera, and a 2 megapixel macro camera. This is definitely an improvement from its predecessor because the ultra-wide camera is actually able to be used in photos this time, whereas the Moto G Stylus 2020 was only able to use the ultra-wide camera in video mode. I thought that was a little weird, but luckily, that's no longer the case. Now the Moto G Power has a 48 megapixel rear camera, a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera, and a 2 megapixel macro camera. So basically it has the same cameras except it doesn't have an ultra wide camera. Other than the ultra wide camera, these cameras seem to be the same between these two phones, but let's see how they actually perform. Right now we're in the regular photo mode for the Moto G Stylus, and it does look really good. The image is crisp, the colors are really well balanced, there's no obnoxious glare, the lighting is perfect. I really have no complaints about this. In the ultra wide mode, it looks really nice, nothing is too blurry, nothing is warped either, and those are two things that I have noticed about other phones in a similar level to this phone. A lot of times the more entry level and mid-range phones that do have ultra wide cameras tend to either get super warped or really blurry when you switch to ultra wide mode, but with this phone that's not really the case. The colors stay the same and the image is still pretty crisp, so that's really nice to see. In the macro mode, it definitely really looks good. The picture is really crisp, there's no problem with the exposure, and the focus is really great as well. Those are all little things that a lot of the time some phones do struggle with at this price point, but this macro camera is really good and I would definitely say it's usable. This is the front-facing camera for the Moto G Stylus. It definitely looks good and the image is crisp. I don't have any complaints. The only thing I would say that stands out to me a little bit is the colors aren't quite as strong as they were on the rear camera, but really it's a small difference and I do think it still looks good. This is portrait mode for the front-facing camera. I do think the portrait mode looks really nice. A lot of the time on entry-level and mid-range phones, the portrait mode doesn't blend very well with the subject, but this one looks really good. Of course, the camera between me and the phone isn't really helping a whole lot, but at the same time, it does seem to recognize my face as the subject and it is blurring the background appropriately, so it's not too bad. Another feature I like about this portrait mode is that you can control the blur. I would say when it comes to taking photos, especially on a mobile device, having more control over any aspect that you can is always a good thing, so I like this feature a lot. This is the regular photo mode for the Moto G Power. Now it looks really similar, pretty much the same as the Moto G Stylus. I feel like they probably do have the same camera. The colors look the same, the image looks crisp, which is definitely a good thing because they both have great rear cameras. This is the macro mode for the Moto G Power. I'm gonna say this one is definitely not nearly as good as the Moto G Stylus. The image is actually pretty blurry. The exposure is really bright. And even if I try to move it on this little tab, it just gets way too dark then. So I wouldn't say that this one is nearly as usable. And the focus keeps twitching a little bit, which can definitely get in the way of a photo if you're trying to take it. Overall, I don't think the macro camera on the Moto G Power has the same quality as that of the Moto G Stylus. Even though they have the same megapixel amount, most likely what's happening is the Moto G Stylus has a better sensor. So even though they do have the same megapixels, a better sensor is definitely gonna make a big difference. Now this is the front-facing camera for the Moto G Power. It does look good. It doesn't look quite as crisp as the Moto G Stylus did. The colors are a little bit more saturated, I would say, which isn't a bad thing. It still really does look good. In general, I still would say this front-facing camera is suitable for everyday use, which is nice. This is the portrait mode for the front-facing camera. I honestly might even say the portrait mode for this front-facing camera is a little bit better. The colors look more distinct, and at the same time, they don't look oversaturated either. I think the balance in this one is better because although the rear camera for the Moto G Stylus was great, it didn't have the same effect in the front-facing camera, whereas this one, it really does stand out in the front-facing camera. The colors look really good, even though the image might not be quite as crisp. The colors and the blending of the background with the portrait mode really do look nice. So in general, I would say I'm not the biggest fan of the Moto G Stylus's front-facing camera. I do think the Moto G Power has a little bit of an edge when it comes to that due to personal preference most likely. But at the end of the day, the Moto G Stylus definitely does have the better camera overall, especially since it has an ultra-wide camera and the Moto G Power doesn't. And this point is even more emphasized by the fact that the Moto G Stylus not only does have an ultra-wide camera, but is actually a pretty good ultra-wide camera too. As far as video mode goes, the Moto G Stylus is able to shoot 4K in the rear camera and 1080p in the front, whereas the Moto G Power shoots 1080p in both the rear and the front. So when it comes to video, the Moto G Stylus, again, has a little bit of an edge. Now internally, the Moto G Stylus 2021 is getting 4GB of RAM with a Qualcomm Snapdragon 678 processor. I ran a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on both of these phones. The Moto G Stylus has a single core score of 538 and a multi-core score of 1588. The Moto G Power 2021 is getting 3GB of RAM with a Qualcomm Snapdragon 662 processor. Now keep in mind, again, there are two variants of this phone. There's another variant that's getting 4GB of RAM, and that is the 64GB internal storage version of this phone. But for the purposes of this video, this is the one that gets 3GB of RAM, so there could be a difference there. That being said, this phone came back with a single core score of 306 and a multi-core score of 1370. So you can definitely see there is a performance difference. The Moto G Stylus is going to have a noticeably more powerful processor than that of the Moto G Power. Now, numbers on Geekbench are definitely one thing, but seeing them in action is another. So we're going to test a few web pages and see how these phones compare as far as speed goes. We're going to open up Google Chrome. That's very close, but I could definitely tell the Moto G Stylus opened a little bit faster. We're gonna go to a web page real quick. It was definitely a little bit more clear there. The Moto G Stylus, again, is a little bit faster. We're gonna try one more page. And there you have it. As you could see from that test, even though they were both really close and they both perform really well, the Moto G Stylus does have a little bit of an edge. There's not a huge difference in processing power. It's not like this one's lightning fast and this one's a slug. But at the same time, in prolonged use, if you're doing a lot of content consumption, web browsing, all of that kind of stuff, you're definitely going to see a difference in performance with the Moto G Stylus as opposed to the Moto G Power. There is a performance difference. The Moto G Stylus is a little bit of a faster phone. So keeping that in mind, especially if you're doing more mid-level activities like social media browsing, heavier content consumption, and gaming, you're definitely going to want to think about that. Now, battery-wise, there is a little bit of a difference between these two phones. The Moto G Stylus has a 4,000 milliamp hour battery that supports 10 watt fast charging, and the Moto G Power has a 5,000 milliamp hour battery that supports 15 watt fast charging. Now this is definitely where the Moto G Power has a bit of an edge. Not only does it support more powerful fast charging, but it also has a significantly more powerful battery as well. So as the battery degrades, which inevitably any battery will, that's just how batteries work, you're not going to notice it as much with the Moto G Power as you will with the Moto G Stylus. So in general, as far as battery goes, the Moto G Power is going to have a little bit more longevity and it'll have better battery life overall because the battery is a little bit bigger. Now, in conclusion, which one of these phones is better? Now, one final difference between these two devices that doesn't really have anything to do with specs per se, but more the design of the phone, is, of course, as its name suggests, the Moto G stylus does have a stylus, whereas the Moto G Power does not. And this stylus is really useful, especially if you do something like drawing. You can do all of that, and it's a really responsive stylus as well. You can do coloring, all that kind of stuff. I'm really bad at coloring, by the way, as you can probably tell. But really, that is something to think about. The stylus is not super high quality like the Samsung Galaxy Note 20 Ultra would be, but for a mid-range phone, it's definitely usable. And I would say that for the advantages styluses usually provide, it is really good. Now, in conclusion, which one of these is the better device? This is close, but based on the specs, the performance we've seen, and the overall features of the phones, I would say the Moto G Stylus 2021 is better than the Moto G Power 2021. Now, based on your needs, which one would work best for you might be different. Now, if you're doing a lot of content consumption, if you need something that has a little bit more performance, or you're doing other activities like drawing, then the Moto G Stylus 2021 is definitely gonna be the better device for you. But if you're on the go a lot and don't always get the chance to plug your phone in and value battery life more than overall performance, then the Moto G Power 2021 might be the device for you. But at the end of the day, both of them are really great devices, and for a mid-range performance device, I don't think you would go wrong with either of them. Again, if you want to get some more information about pricing or availability of these devices, be sure to check the links in the description because prices are always changing. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to leave a thumbs up and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video.